Her stepbrother laughed out loud in the lawyer's office. 200 acres went to him. The house went to her stepsister. $42,000 went to the youngest. And Merritt Vale, 19 years old, 12 years of washing that woman's dishes, driving her to every appointment, reading scripture aloud, when her eyes gave out, got a dead gristmill on a creek that should have been torn down in 1974. She didn't cry. Not one tear, not in front of them. But that night she found an iron key in the pocket of the sweater Corvina Hale died wearing, and a note in handwriting that shook. Wait until they're asleep. Go alone. I've been getting ready for 12 years. If this story reaches you tonight, subscribe and stay with Merritt to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see how far her story travels. 3 days before that will was read, Merritt Vale carried a cup of chamomile tea up the stairs and found her mother sitting against the pillows with her eyes closed and a small smile on her face, like she had just been told something good. Merritt set the tea down on the nightstand very carefully. She remembers being careful about it. She remembers thinking that the sound of ceramic on wood might wake her, which was a stupid thing to think, and she thought it anyway. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and took Corvina Hale's hand and held it. It was still warm. That was the part that would not leave her afterward. Not the funeral, not the will, not any of what came next. Just that. For however many minutes she sat there before she understood. Her mother's hand had still been warm, and Merritt had held it and said nothing at all, because she had not yet been told she was allowed to fall apart. She did not cry that morning. She did not cry that afternoon. She called the doctor and then the funeral home, and then Deacon, and then Sable, and then Tobin. In that order, in a voice so steady that the woman at the funeral home asked twice whether she was a family member. Merritt said she was the daughter. There was a pause on the line. And the woman asked her to spell her last name because it did not match. The reading was on a Thursday morning in March, in a small law office on the main street of Hollow Ford. And Merritt wore the black dress Corvina had bought her 2 Christmases before. The one Corvina had said made her look like a woman instead of a girl. She didn't feel like a woman that morning. She didn't feel like anything. Deacon Hale sat in the front row with his arms crossed, clearing his throat every 30 seconds, like a man waiting on a delayed flight. He was 32. He had driven down from Charlotte the day after the death and had spent that entire first evening opening drawers in his stepmother's kitchen, looking for the checkbook. Sable Hale sat beside him, with her phone in her lap, thumb moving not once, looking up. She was 33. She had walked through the farmhouse the day she arrived, running her hand along the mantel, and checking behind the pictures, like a woman appraising a hotel she was thinking of buying. And Tobin sat at the end of the row, with his shoulders up around his ears, 26 years old, and folded into that chair like a boy waiting outside a principal's office. Corbin Whitlock put on his glasses and started to read. 200 acres of the north and east pasture to Deacon Hale. Deacon leaned back and nodded once slow, like a man receiving something that had been overdue. The main house and all its contents and the 3 acres surrounding it to Sable Hale. Sable's thumb stopped moving on the phone screen. She did not look up. The savings account at the credit union balance approximately $42,000 to Tobin Hale. Tobin made a sound that was half a cough and half something worse, and pressed his fist against his mouth. Merritt waited. She wasn't expecting anything. She had told herself that on the drive over. She had told herself that maybe 100 times in 3 days, lying awake in the room over the garage. You are not a Hale, you are a Vale. You were never in the will, you were never supposed to be in the will. Except that woman had held her hand every single night for 12 years. Except that woman had called her my girl in front of the whole feed store. Except that woman had cried at her high school graduation, standing in the aisle in her good coat, not caring who saw, saying, "Look at you, would you just look at you?" Corbin Whitlock cleared his throat and read her name. Deacon's head came up fast the way a dog's head comes up at a stick snapping in the woods. To Merritt Vale, I leave the old grist mill on Sawyer's Creek and the half-acre of land surrounding it. And then there was about 1 full second of nothing at all. Then Deacon laughed. It wasn't a chuckle, and it wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was delighted, one short, hard bark of a laugh that came out of him before he could decide whether to let it. He said the mill out loud like it was a punchline. He said the county had condemned that thing before he was old enough to drive. He said you could push it into the creek with a shopping cart. He shook his head, still grinning, and he looked over at his sister for backup, the way he had been looking at her for 30 years. And Sable Hale finally raised her eyes. She looked at Merritt, and for one flickering strange second, a second Merritt would take apart 1,000 times over the next 4 days. Sable's eyes were not cold. They were something else entirely. Something Merritt had no name for. Then Sable looked away and said very quietly that it seemed fair enough. At the end of the row, Tobin pushed his chair back and stood up too fast, and then sat down again, without going anywhere. Whitlock kept reading. Property taxes, a 30-day window. Merritt stopped hearing him. 12 years. 12 years of scrubbing that kitchen floor on her knees. 12 years of driving that woman to Asheville and back in the dark. 12 years of holding her hair when the medicine came up. 12 Christmas mornings with 3 stockings on the mantel, and a fourth one she had hung herself, and a dead mill on a creek. Merritt looked down at her own hands folded in her lap and saw that the knuckles had gone white. Don't cry. Don't you dare cry in front of them. Not one tear. She lifted her chin. She looked out the window at the rain, which was coming down sideways, angry, the kind of rain that doesn't wash anything clean. Now, the story doesn't start with a will. It starts 13 years earlier on Christmas Eve on a black stretch of highway outside Asheville. Merritt was 6 years old. She was in the back seat in a red velvet dress with a white ribbon at the collar, and her mother had braided her hair that morning with little sprigs of holly tucked into the ends. Her mother's name was Nella. Her father's name was Peter. They were driving home from the candlelight service. A truck came around the bend. The road was black ice. That was the whole of it. Merritt does not remember the impact. She remembers waking up in a hospital and a woman in scrubs, telling her that her mother and father had gone to be with Jesus. And she remembers thinking that was a strange way to say it, because Jesus lived up in the sky, and her mother had been afraid of heights. For the next year, she lived at St. Bernadette's Children's Home in Asheville. She did not speak for 4 months. She wet the bed for 6. And she would not let anyone touch her hair, not one of them, not once, because the last person who had touched her hair had braided holly into it and then died. And then, in the fall of 2012, a woman came. She was tall and broad through the shoulders with gray hair pulled back hard, and she was wearing a barn coat that smelled like hay and diesel, and her boots had left mud on the linoleum, and her hands were red and cracked from the cold. She did not look like anybody's mother. She looked like exactly what she was, which was a farmer. Corvina Hale, 51 years old, widowed 2 years, 250 acres, up in Hollow Ford. The social worker crouched down and said this was Miss Corvina, and that she had come a long way. Merritt stared at the floor. And Corvina did not say hello, and did not ask her a single question, and did not do the voice that adults do. She just got down on the floor too, slow, careful, her knees cracking like green wood when she went. And she stayed there. Then she said something Merritt would carry for the rest of her life. She said she didn't need her to talk. She didn't need her to smile. She didn't need her to like her today or tomorrow or ever if she didn't want to. Merritt looked up, just a little. Just enough to see that the woman's eyes were gray, like the sky right before it snows. And Corvina said that if she wanted, she could come home, that there was a room with a window facing east, so a person could watch the sun come up, and a quilt on the bed that her own mother had stitched, and a cat. She said the cat's name was Butter. She said he was stupid, but he was kind. Merritt whispered something so quietly that Corvina had to lean in. She had asked whether the cat was really named Butter, and Corvina Hale said, "Cross my heart?" And a 6-year-old girl, who had not voluntarily touched an adult in 11 months, stood up, walked over and put her small hand into a rough red one. That was how it started. There were 3 things nobody told Merritt in that first year, and every one of them would cost her later. The first was that Corvina had 3 grown stepchildren. She found that out on the 7th day. When Deacon came home from Burlington, walked into the kitchen, saw a little girl sitting at the table, and stopped dead in the doorway and asked who that was. Corvina didn't turn around from the stove. She said that was Merritt, and Merritt lived here now. He asked what she meant lived here. She said she meant lived here. He started in on it. "Come on, Ma." And Corvina turned around slow, with a wooden spoon in her hand, and said his name. Just his name, nothing after it. And Deacon Hale shut his mouth. He looked at the child at the table for about 3 seconds. Then he took a beer out of the refrigerator and walked out of the room without saying one word to her. That was Deacon. Sable came the following weekend, 20 years old and home from college, and she walked straight past Merritt into the kitchen and started whispering fast and sharp at Corvina. Words like, "What were you thinking?" and "How long is she staying?" And Corvina said one thing back low and flat: "She's staying." That was Sable. Tobin came third. He was 13. He came home from school, dropped his bag, saw a little girl on the couch with a cat asleep on her legs, and tilted his head and asked if she was the new kid. She nodded. He told her his name. She told him hers. He asked if she liked cats. She said yes. He said cool, went into the kitchen, came back with a granola bar, broke it in half and handed her half of it. Then he said, "Welcome home," and went upstairs to do his homework. That was Tobin. And that was the last easy thing about him. The second thing nobody told her was where those 3 had come from. They were not Corvina's children. They were Elias Hale's. From his first wife, a woman named Wanda, who had died of something fast and terrible when Tobin was 3, and Sable was 8, and Deacon was 11. Elias married Corvina 2 years after that. So Corvina raised those 3. She fed them and bandaged them and sat up with their fevers and taught 2 of them to drive. But she was never mama, not once, not one of them, not in 30 years. She was always Corvina, and in the small, private, locked-off part of that woman's heart, there had always been an ache, the ache of a woman who spent her entire married life asking God for one child of her own body and never getting an answer. Merritt didn't know any of that, not for years. All she knew was that Corvina loved her and that the other three did not. Deacon treated her like hired help. He handed her his coat when he walked in. He asked her when dinner would be ready. Never please, never thank you. He said her name maybe 4 times a year and never once when there was a witness who mattered. Sable treated her like a ghost, walked past her in hallways, made small surgical remarks about her hair, her clothes, the way she held a fork. The kind of remark that is never quite bad enough to repeat to an adult, which is exactly what makes it work. And Tobin. Tobin was the strange one because Tobin was kind. When it was the two of them out in the barn, he talked to her. He asked about school. He told her about a girl he liked. He called her Mary like a brother would. And the second deacon walked in. Tobin went silent, stepped back half a pace and looked at the floor. Merritt understood it before she had the words for it. She was 8 years old, and she understood that Tobin was afraid of his own brother, and that the fear was bigger than the kindness. She forgave him for it every single time. She could not have told you why. Christmas 2013. Merritt was 7. Corvina hung 4 stockings over the fireplace and made a whole thing of it, standing back with her hands on her hips to check they were even. Christmas morning, Merritt came down first and found hers on the floor. She didn't tell anyone. She picked it up, hung it back on the hook, and then went into the kitchen and filled it herself with butterscotch candies out of the dish by the phone so that Corvina wouldn't notice it was empty. She was 7 years old, and she was already managing that woman's feelings. Thanksgiving 2015. Merritt was 9. She helped cook for 2 days, peeled every potato in that house. There were 5 place settings on the table: Deacon and his girlfriend, Sable and her boyfriend, Tobin, Corvina. Corvina saw it before she sat down, and her face went the color of paper. She asked where Merritt's plate was, and Sable shrugged and said she'd only counted 5. Corvina said there were 6 of them. She said it twice. Then she got up, went to the cabinet, took down another plate, and set it on that table, hard enough that the water glasses jumped. Merritt came out of the kitchen, still wearing her apron, cheeks red from the oven. Nobody said grace that year. And later that night, when the cars were gone and Merritt was at the sink alone with the roasting pan, Corvina came in and stood behind her and said, "You are my daughter, do you hear me?" Merritt said yes. Corvina told her to say it back. Merritt said she was her daughter. Corvina told her to say it louder, and she did. But here is the thing about being told you belong somewhere, while every other person in the house is quietly telling you the opposite. The years kept coming. Deacon kept handing her his coat. Sable kept walking past her like she was furniture. Tobin kept looking at the floor. And little by little, in a place under her ribs she never let anybody see, Merritt started to wonder, am I actually her daughter? Or am I the girl she picked up from a home? She never once asked Corvina, not in 12 years, because she was terrified of the answer. The third thing nobody told her, and this one nearly ended her, was that Corvina Hale was dying. Merritt was 16. It was mud season. Corvina had been coughing for a week and calling it a cold. On the 10th day, Merritt went upstairs, looking for her, and found her sitting on the edge of the tub, with one hand pressed flat against her chest, bent forward. There was blood in the sink. Corvina said she'd bitten her cheek. Merritt said she was bleeding. Corvina said it was nothing, honey. And Merritt, 16 years old, 5'4", standing in a bathroom doorway, with her heart going like a rabbit, said, "Please, just that, please." Corvina closed her eyes for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." They drove to the clinic in Marshall. Merritt sat in that waiting room for 2 hours and 20 minutes and read the same page of a hunting magazine 11 times. Corvina came out carrying a folder thick with paper and did not show her one page of it. She said they wanted her to see a specialist in Asheville. Merritt said she'd drive her. Corvina said she didn't have to. Merritt said she'd drive her. And Corvina Hale looked at that girl for a long time. Long enough that Merritt started to feel it in her stomach. And then said, "Okay, honey. Okay." She never told her the diagnosis. Not that year, not the next, not the one after that. She just kept going to appointments, kept taking pills. Merritt didn't recognize, and couldn't find the bottles for afterward. Kept losing weight so slowly that you could only see it if you laid 2 photographs side by side, which Merritt eventually did alone at 2 in the morning, and then put away and did not look at again. Merritt knew. Of course she knew. But every single time she tried to open her mouth about it, Corvina would take both her hands and shake her head and say, "Not yet, honey. Not yet." So Merritt stopped asking. She kept driving her. She kept making the tea. She kept holding her hand. She kept not knowing on purpose for 3 years, because that was what the woman wanted. And Merritt had never in her life been able to want something Corvina didn't. The night before she died, Corvina asked Merritt to sit with her on the couch. She was wrapped in the quilt her mother had stitched. She held Merritt's hand, and her fingers were thin and cold. And Merritt kept rubbing them without thinking about it the way you do. They sat a long while without either of them saying anything. Then Corvina said her name. And she said she needed Merritt to promise her something. Merritt said anything. And Corvina said, "When I'm gone." And Merritt started to shake her head, and Corvina squeezed her hand hard enough to hurt and said it again. "When I'm gone, I need you to be brave. Braver than you have ever been in your whole life." Merritt asked her what that meant. Corvina didn't answer that. She just asked her to promise. So Merritt promised. And Corvina Hale closed her eyes and smiled a little and said, "Good girl." She said it twice. Merritt covered her with the quilt, kissed her forehead, and went up to bed. In the morning, she carried up a cup of chamomile tea and found her sitting against the pillows with her eyes closed and that small smile on her face. And after the funeral and after the will and after Deacon, stood in that hallway telling Sable to call the salvage company because there might be copper in the mill walls. Merritt drove home in Corvina's old truck and sat in the driveway with both hands on the wheel for a long time, exactly the way Corvina used to sit. Then she went inside, and she did not go to her own room over the garage. She went to Corvina's. The teacup was still on the nightstand. Somebody had pulled the curtains shut. Merritt opened them. The blue cardigan was over the back of the rocking chair, the one that still smelled like her. Merritt picked it up and held it to her face, lavender and ivory soap and a little hay. And then something in her chest came apart all at once, and she cried the way she had not cried since she was 6 years old. When it finally stopped, she put her hand in the cardigan pocket. Not for any reason, just to touch something that woman's hand had touched. Her fingers closed on something small and cold and metal. She pulled it out. An iron key. Old, dark with age. She put her hand back in the pocket, and there was a piece of paper folded down to the size of a napkin. She opened it with hands that had very suddenly stopped shaking. The handwriting was Corvina's, but barely the letters, dragging the pen pressed too hard in places where the hand had lost control. "Wait until they're asleep." You have to go alone. Mama's been getting ready for 12 years. Merritt read it 3 times before the last word registered. Mama. In 12 years, that woman had never once signed anything, Mama. Not a birthday card. Not a permission slip. Not a single note left on the kitchen counter. She had always signed Love, Corvina. Every time without exception. And Merritt had noticed. She had noticed every single time for 12 years, and she had built a small, quiet theory out of it that she never said out loud to anyone. But at the end, with a hand that could barely hold the pen, she had signed it, Mama. Merritt sat down hard on the edge of that bed. The iron key felt very heavy in her palm. She made them dinner that night. She has thought about that a great deal since. That with an iron key in her pocket and a note in her sock drawer that said Mama, she got up and made pot roast for the 2 people who had just laughed at her in a lawyer's office. But that was 12 years of muscle memory. And muscle memory does not care what your heart is doing. She set the table. She poured the wine. Deacon ate 2 helpings and told her it was oversalted. Sable moved food around her plate and looked at her phone. Tobin didn't come down at all. Merritt could hear him overhead. 6 steps one direction, turned 6 steps back, for most of an hour. Afterward, she washed every dish, wiped the counters, turned off the lights and went up to her room over the garage, and sat on the edge of her bed, in the dark, fully dressed with her boots on. And she waited. Deacon's light went off at 11. Sable's a little after midnight. The pacing overhead stopped somewhere around 1. At 2 in the morning, Merritt Vale stood up, put on Corvina's blue cardigan, put the iron key in the pocket, and went down the stairs, skipping the 3rd step from the top because it creaked. And she had known that since she was 7 years old. Out through the kitchen, out the back door. And she got maybe 15 feet across the wet grass before she heard the door open behind her. She froze. She would tell somebody later that in that half second, she genuinely believed it was Deacon, and that her first instinct, her actual first instinct at 19, was to apologize for being outside. She turned around. It was Sable. Barefoot in the wet grass in a white nightgown, with her arms wrapped around her own ribs, 33 years old, and shaking with cold or something else. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Sable came down off the porch and crossed the lawn and stopped about 6 feet away. And Merritt braced for it, for the comment, for the "What do you think you're doing out here?" It didn't come. Sable said her name. Just her name. And then, in a voice that had dropped almost to nothing, she said, "Don't let Deacon find out." Merritt said she didn't understand. And Sable said it again faster. "Don't let him find out you were out here. Don't let him see you anywhere near that mill. Do you understand me?" Merritt started to say her name, and Sable cut her off. "Please listen to me." And something in that woman's face was coming apart. A crack running right through a mask she had been wearing for 12 years. She said, "You don't know him. You have never known him. And that is because I have spent every single day of the last 12 years making sure you never had to." Merritt could not make a sound. Then Sable reached into the pocket of her nightgown and took out a small photo album. The cheap kind vinyl cover, the kind you buy at a drugstore, and held it out. She said, "Take this. Read it tonight. Don't let him see it. Don't let anyone see it." And then she said the thing that made Merritt's arms go cold. "Whatever you find in that mill, please don't tell him." She turned and walked back across the grass and into the house, and the door clicked shut, and Merritt stood alone, with an iron key in one pocket and a stranger's 12 years in her hand. The mill sat where the creek bent, down past the pasture, and Merritt had never once been inside it, not in 12 years. She had asked when she was small, more than once. And every time Corvina had given her that quiet, particular smile and said the same sentence, "Some places aren't ready to be opened yet, honey." Merritt had always assumed she meant it was unsafe. Rotten floorboards, loose nails, the kind of thing a farm woman says to keep a child out of a building. Standing in front of it at 2 in the morning, that sentence played back in her head in a completely different key. The doors were oak-weathered silver, and there was a heavy chain across the handles, not padlocked, just wrapped. Merritt noticed that, and did not know yet why it mattered. She lifted the chain off, and it clanked, and she flinched hard and looked back toward the house. No lights, no movement. She put her shoulder into the doors, and they resisted, and then gave all at once with a long, low groan of wood, remembering how to open. She stepped inside and stopped, because the mill was not empty. Not the way Deacon described it, not the way anybody in that family had ever described it. It was full of the same tired things. Every dead mill is full of wooden gearing and grain scoops and stacked flour barrels and coils of belt leather gone stiff as bone. But every single object in that building had been arranged, not stacked, not shoved into a corner. Arranged, squared off, grouped set, at right angles, the way a shopkeeper closes up at night. Somebody had been in here, for years, regularly, with a broom. And Merritt stood in that doorway and felt the first real crack go through everything she thought she knew about the last 12 years. Because the woman who had been in here was Corvina Hale. And Corvina Hale had told her every time she asked that there was nothing out here for her. There was a path swept clean through the middle of the floor, not worn, swept. A narrow, clear trail leading straight to the back corner, and Merritt followed it because there was nothing else in the world to do. At the end of it, under a folded American flag laid over a beam, there was a pile of chaff, ordinary, innocent-looking, except the dust on the floorboards around it was disturbed in 2 round patches side by side, about 18 inches apart. Knees, somebody had knelt there recently. Merritt got down and brushed the chaff aside with both hands, and she found the edge of a square cut into the floor, clean and perfect with an iron ring set into the middle of it. Her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her jaw. She got her fingers through the ring and pulled. The trap door came up with a sigh, and cold air came out of it. And this is the detail she still can't explain properly to anybody. It did not smell like a cellar. It smelled like cedar and ink. And underneath, both faintly, unmistakably, the hand cream Corvina Hale had used every night of her life. Merritt sat back on her heels and put both hands over her mouth. There were stone steps going down into the dark. She stood up on legs that did not entirely work and looked around for a light. And there was a brass lantern hanging on a rusted hook 8 feet away. She took it down and shook it, and it was heavy. There was oil in it. Somebody had filled that lantern recently, within weeks, maybe days. And Merritt stood in a condemned mill at 2 in the morning, holding a full lamp that a dying woman had climbed out here to fill, and understood that she had been expected. It took her 3 matches. Her hands would not hold still. The wick caught. The glass bloomed gold. She stood at the top of the stairs, and she looked down, And she went. She counted them going down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her free hand ran along stone that was cool and dry, not damp, which was wrong for a cellar next to a creek. And she registered it without understanding it. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Her boot hit flat ground. She lifted the lantern, and Merritt Vale made a sound. Not a word, not a sob, just the noise a person makes walking into a place they were not prepared for. Because it was not a cellar. It was a room. The walls were rough-cut stone, but the floor was wood. New wood, sanded smooth, fitted tight. There was a braided rag rug in the middle, red and blue and cream. There was a rocking chair, and the cushion on that chair was faded blue calico. And Merritt knew that fabric instantly, because it had been an apron Corvina wore on Sundays until it wore through at the ties and then disappeared out of the kitchen 4 or 5 years ago, and Merritt had never once wondered where it went. There was a small table beside the chair, a handmade cross on the wall, a bookshelf, a cedar chest, a lamp, and on every wall, in rough wooden frames, somebody had clearly hammered together herself, there were photographs of Merritt. Merritt at 7 on the porch. First week swallowed by a coat 2 sizes too big. Merritt at 8 feeding a calf from a bottle, with her whole tongue stuck out in concentration. Merritt at 10 missing a front tooth, grinning like an idiot. Merritt at 12 braids reading on the porch swing with her feet up. Merritt at 15 in a homecoming dress she had been sure she looked stupid in. Merritt at 17 on the tractor. Merritt at 18 with a graduation cap in her hand. Merritt at 19. This past Christmas 3 months ago, a photo Tobin had taken, and she hadn't even known was being taken. She had to put the lantern down on the table because her hand had stopped working. She sat down in the rocking chair. She turned her head slowly and looked at every wall, and she said out loud in a voice that did not sound like her own, "What did you do?" But she already knew. Corvina Hale had built a chapel to her daughter. And she had been coming down here for years, to sit, to pray, to watch a girl grow up in photographs, to love a child who had no idea on earth she was being loved this way. And that was the thing that finally broke Merritt Vale in half. Not the funeral, not the will, not Deacon's laugh. This, that for 12 years she had lain awake, asking herself whether she was really that woman's daughter or just a girl picked up from a home. And the answer had been sitting under a mill floor 400 yards from her bedroom window the entire time. She wept the way you weep when you find out somebody has been carrying you your whole life, and you never felt it. When she could see again, she wiped her face on the sleeve of the blue cardigan and looked at the cedar chest. It sat at the foot of the rocking chair like a footstool, like something that had been waiting a long time to be a footstool for exactly one person. She knelt in front of it and lifted the lid. Cedar and paper and something like church candles. Inside were 12 envelopes, each one tied with a piece of blue ribbon, each one addressed in that same careful hand. For Merritt, 2012. For Merritt, 2013. Down and down to for Merritt, 2023. 12 letters, one for every year that woman had been her mother. Underneath them was a leather journal with a cord tied around it in a bow, and Merritt lifted it out and opened the cover, and the first page said, "If you are reading this, Merritt, it means I couldn't tell you with my own mouth. Forgive me for that. Start with 2012. Read them in order. Take your time. I have waited 12 years. You don't need to hurry." She untied the first ribbon. The 2012 letter was short, and it destroyed her inside of 4 sentences. Corvina wrote that Merritt was 7 years old, that she had been there 4 months, that she had slept through the night for the first time the previous week, and that Corvina had stood outside her bedroom door until sunrise, just to listen to her breathe. She wrote that she had not known a person could love a stranger this much. She wrote that Butter had decided Merritt was his person, now that he slept on her feet and hissed at Corvina, and that she didn't mind because he had picked well. And then she wrote a sentence that stopped Merritt's heart entirely. I hope one day you'll know that a woman in Hollow Ford started praying for you the day she saw your face on the news, and that she hasn't stopped, and that she won't. Merritt lowered the page. The day she saw your face on the news. Nobody had ever said that. Not once. Not in 12 years. Merritt had always assumed it happened the ordinary way. A social worker, a placement list, a form, a home study. That she had been a name that came up. But Corvina Hale had seen her on television. Merritt sat there on the floor of that room holding a letter from 2012 and felt the whole shape of her own life shift, half an inch to the left. She reached for the next envelope. She read them straight through, and every letter was a window into a year she thought she had lived alone. The year she learned to bake bread. Corvina wrote that Merritt's first loaf came out flat as a dinner plate, and that Corvina had eaten a slice of it with butter, and then cried, standing at the sink, while Merritt was outside with the chickens, because the girl had said she wanted to learn to do it the way you do it. God forgive me, Corvina wrote. I didn't know I wanted anything that badly until I heard her say it. The year Merritt won the county spelling bee, Corvina wrote that she'd bought a small silver frame for the certificate and hung it out in the mill, where Merritt would never see it. Because Deacon had been home that weekend and had made a joke about wanting to put it on the refrigerator, and Merritt had gone quiet and taken it up to her room and never mentioned it again. Merritt had forgotten that. She read the letter and remembered it whole in about 2 seconds, the way you do, the year she broke her arm falling off the loft ladder. Corvina wrote that when the nurse asked if she was the mother, she'd said yes, without hesitating. And then I cried in that parking lot afterward, because I have been so afraid that one day somebody will ask me for paperwork, and Merritt will find out she is still on paper, only a foster placement that was never finalized. Merritt stopped. She read that sentence again, then a third time. Only a foster placement that was never finalized. She had believed for 12 years that the adoption had gone through. Nobody had ever told her it had. She realized that sitting on that floor, nobody had ever actually said the words. She had simply assumed it the way a child assumes the roof will hold, and then she had grown up and never once questioned it. Her stomach turned over. She kept reading faster now, hands not steady. And 4 letters later, she found out why. Corvina wrote that Deacon had found out she was preparing to file. She wrote, I do not know how. He came to see me. He sat at my own kitchen table, and he told me that if I signed those papers, he would contest the will. He said he would drag her name through court. He said he'd testify that I wasn't competent. He said he would say she manipulated a sick old woman. He said he would ruin her life to spite me. I couldn't risk it. I know that makes me a coward, but she had already lost one mother. I could not make her lose a second one in a courtroom with lawyers with her name in a county record. So I didn't sign. And I have spent every year since finding other ways to protect her. Quiet ways. Ways he can't fight in a courtroom. The mill is one of them. You'll understand, honey, when you find this. Merritt sat very still. Her mother had been afraid. For 12 years, that enormous woman with the rough red hands, who could throw a calf and shout down a bank manager, that woman had been afraid of her own stepson in her own house and had never let Merritt see it once. And all at once, 100 small things Merritt had never questioned came back and lined themselves up. Why Corvina never let Deacon drive her to a single appointment. Why she kept her checkbook locked in a drawer in her own home. Why she put Merritt on her health insurance 3 years ago and got strange and short about it when Merritt said it wasn't necessary. Why the mill doors were chained but never padlocked. Because a padlock is something people ask about. Why she'd said, some places aren't ready to be opened yet. Not unsafe. Not safe yet. There was one letter Merritt did not want to open, the 2021 envelope. She knew what year that was. That was the cough. That was the blood in the sink. That was the specialist in Asheville. In the folder full of paper she was never allowed to see. She opened it anyway. Corvina wrote that they had given her a diagnosis that day and that she was not going to write the word down, because words like that have too much power. And she did not want it living in this letter. She wrote they said maybe 3 years. 4 if I fight hard, I'm not going to tell you. I know how that sounds. But listen to me, honey. You're 16. You're supposed to go to college. You're supposed to fall in love and get your heart broken and put it back together. You are not supposed to spend your last years of being a girl sitting in a hospice with an old woman. And I know you. I know exactly what you would do if I told you. You'd quit school inside a week. You'd move a cot into my bedroom. You'd hand me every single day you have left in the world. And you'd do it gladly. And I love you far too much to let you. So I'm going to lie to you. I'm going to call it a cough. And when it gets bad, I'm going to hide it. And if God is kind about it, I'll make it look like I went in my sleep. Please forgive me for that. If you're reading this, he was kind. So promise me something, my girl. Live. Live all the way. Don't shrink because I'm gone. Take up every inch of your life. Live like somebody loves you. Because somebody does, and somebody always will, even when you can't see her. All my love, Mama. Merritt got off the chair and onto the rag rug and put her forehead against it. She cried harder than she had cried in her entire life. Harder than the hospital when she was 6. Harder than the bedroom 3 days ago. Because Corvina Hale had known for 3 years. 3 years of driving to Asheville with Merritt at the wheel and saying it was just follow-ups. 3 years of standing at that stove, making dinner for a girl who had no idea she was watching a woman use herself up on purpose. 3 years of pretending so that Merritt could stay in school. So Merritt could keep being a girl. So Merritt could stay free. That woman had spent the last 3 years of her life dying quietly on a schedule so her daughter wouldn't have to watch. It was a long time before Merritt sat up. When she did, she wiped her face with both hands and looked around that little room. At the rocking chair, with the apron cushion at the photographs at 11 letters, still tied with ribbon, and one lying open on the floor. And then she remembered the album, Sable's album, still where she had set it down on the small table when her hands stopped working. She picked it up. She had not opened it yet. She opened it now. The first photograph was Deacon at 9 years old, standing over a smashed model airplane. On the floor behind him, a little girl of about 6 crying. On the back, in a child's careful print. He said I could hold it. Then he said I broke it. He locked me out of my room for a week. Merritt turned the page. Sable at 12. black eye. He said I fell off the fence. I did not. He wouldn't let me come inside until I said I fell. Merritt turned the page again and again, and the pages kept coming. A girl in a prom dress sitting alone, a girl with a torn library book, a girl in the back of a church photo standing 3 feet apart from everybody else. And everyone had a caption on the back, in that same careful print. And everyone was a small private cruelty that nobody in that family had ever said out loud. And then halfway through the album, the photographs changed. They were of Merritt. Merritt at 8 at the kitchen sink up to her elbows in a roasting pan. On the back. He made her wash every dish in the house on Christmas. I did nothing. Merritt at 11, sitting on the porch steps with a backpack in her lap, waiting for a school bus that was not coming. He made her miss the field trip. I said nothing. Merritt at 14 in front of a birthday cake with no candles in it. He threw her candles in the trash. I saw him do it. I said nothing. Merritt stopped on that one. She remembered that birthday. She remembered standing in the kitchen, looking at a cake with nothing on top of it, and deciding in about 4 seconds that she had never liked candles anyway. And then telling herself that for 5 straight years, until she believed it, somebody had been in the room. Somebody had seen it happen. Somebody had taken a photograph of the aftermath and written it down. Sable Hale had been keeping a record for 12 years. And in every single entry, the last line was the same 3 words in slightly different order. I did nothing. I said nothing. I looked away. It was not an album. It was a confession compiled slowly by a woman who had known exactly what she was doing the entire time and had done it anyway. There was a folded letter tucked into the sleeve of the last page. Merritt opened it with her thumb. Sable had written that she had been a coward her whole life, that she had not protected Merritt and had not protected herself, and that she had let her brother do what he did because she had confused staying small with staying safe. Then she wrote the part that took the floor out. I have known about the room for 2 years. Your mother asked me for help. She'd built it over a long time, and she carried everything down there herself while she was still strong. But after she got sick, and she was sick from 2021 on whatever she told you, she couldn't manage the stairs with her hands full anymore. She swore me to secrecy first. Then she asked. I carried the letters down for her. I held the frames while she hammered. I sat on that rug while she wrote to you more than once. And I did not deserve to be in that room, and I knew it. But she needed hands, and she told me I was the only one left who was quiet enough to keep a secret and weak enough to be trusted with it. She said that to my face. And she was right. And it is the only honest thing anyone in this family has said to me in 30 years. Merritt read that twice. Then she read the last paragraph, and everything else in that room went away. I'm telling you now because Deacon is going to take the mill. He is not going to sell it. He is going to level it. He was on the phone with a demolition outfit out of Weaverville last night. I heard him from the hallway. Monday. He said Monday. You have 4 days. Whatever is under that floor, get it out or find a way to protect it. Because if he finds it, he will destroy it. Not because it's worth anything, because it was yours. Merritt closed the album. She sat there for a long moment, without moving at all. Then she stood up, wiped her face with the heel of her hand, and looked around that little room one more time. At the photographs of herself, at every age, at the 11 ribbons still tied at the cushion made out of a Sunday apron. And she said out loud to nobody 4 days. She climbed the stairs. She closed the trap door and pulled the chaff back over it, because that was what Corvina would have done. She hung the lantern back on its hook. Outside, the sky had gone pale gray at the bottom edge, and one bird had started up somewhere in the trees. Merritt stood in the wet grass and looked back at the mill and said quietly, "He is not going to touch you." She meant the building. She also meant the woman. She meant every letter and every photograph and every hour that woman had spent down there alone. Then she turned toward the house and saw a figure sitting on the back steps. Tobin, still in yesterday's clothes. He had not gone to bed at all. Merritt walked up and stopped at the bottom of the steps and asked him how long he had known. He said he hadn't. He said he swore he hadn't. She asked him what he was doing sitting outside at 5 in the morning then, and Tobin said he'd heard Deacon on the phone last night, twice. Once with the demolition company, once with a lawyer in Charlottetown, and it wasn't just the mill. Deacon was going to contest the whole will. He was going to argue that Corvina wasn't of sound mind when she signed it. He was going to argue the document had been tampered with. He was going to argue that Merritt had spent 12 years working an old sick woman for everything she could get. Merritt said he had no proof, and Tobin said that was the part she didn't understand. He didn't need proof. He needed a court date. He needed to make it expensive and slow and public, and keep it going until she couldn't afford a lawyer anymore and signed whatever was put in front of her just to make it stop. Merritt sat down on the bottom step in the wet grass. After a while, she asked him the question she had been carrying since she was 8 years old. She asked why now. She said he had been silent for 12 years, and she needed to know what was different about this particular morning. Tobin looked out at the fields for a long time before he answered. He said it was the photograph on the mantel, the one from her graduation with Corvina's arm around her, both of them laughing at something out of frame. He said he had stood in front of that picture for an hour last night, and that at some point around midnight, he had finally understood something he had been refusing to understand for 12 years. He said she picked you. He said, and she never really picked us. She raised us, and she fed us, and she buried our father with us, and she was good to us every single day, and she never picked us. And that was never your fault. And I have spent 12 years letting my brother punish you for something that was never your fault. His voice went out on the last part. He turned and looked at her and said he was not letting Deacon take the mill. He said he didn't care what it cost him. Merritt started crying again, quietly this time, the way she used to at the kitchen sink where nobody could see. Tobin took her hand. She let him. And the two of them sat there on the wet steps while the sky came up. And somewhere in Merritt's head, in a voice she could hear as clearly as if the woman were standing behind her, Corvina Hale said, "Braver than you have ever been in your whole life." Merritt stood up. She squeezed Tobin's hand once hard, and went inside to make a phone call. The kitchen phone was the old kind with a curly cord mounted on the wall by the door, and Corvina had refused to replace it for 30 years. Merritt picked it up, and her hand was steady, which surprised her because inside her chest, everything was going at once. Tobin had pulled a slip of paper out of his wallet, soft with age folded in quarters. A lawyer in Asheville named Priscilla Ostrander. He'd gone to school with her son. He said she was a bulldog in a cardigan. Merritt dialed. It rang twice. The voice that answered was crisp and awake at 6:10 in the morning. The voice of a woman who had already been at her desk for an hour. Merritt's throat closed. For one horrible second, she could not produce a sound. Then she said, "My mother died 4 days ago." The woman on the other end said she was sorry for her loss and waited. And Merritt said, "My stepbrother is going to sue me. He's going to say I manipulated her. And on Monday morning, he's going to tear down a mill that she left me." There was a pause. Then Priscilla Ostrander asked where she was calling from. Merritt said Hollow Ford, and the woman said, "Give me an hour," and hung up. Merritt stood there holding the receiver against her chest. Tobin was in the doorway watching her. And behind him in the hall, a shadow shifted. Deacon. Bathrobe, bare feet, hair standing up on one side. He had heard the phone. He came into the kitchen slow and easy, the way he did everything, and asked who that was. Merritt said a friend. He said at 6 in the morning. She said yes. He looked at Tobin, then. And this is the moment Merritt has said she'll remember when she's 80. Because for the first time in 12 years, Tobin Hale did not look at the floor. He looked straight back. And Deacon blinked. Once. Just once. But she saw it. The tiny crack in a thing that had never cracked in front of her before. Then he turned back to Merritt and smiled a smile that stopped at his cheekbones and called her sweetheart. She told him she was not his sweetheart. He said her name in a tone of enormous patience, the tone of a man being reasonable with a hysterical child, and told her she had lived under this roof on his mother's generosity for 12 years. And he had never asked her for one thing, and he was asking now. He said, "Don't make this ugly. Take whatever you want out of that mill. Sign the deed back to me, and I'll give you enough money to start somewhere else." Merritt said no. The smile went off his face like a light switch. He said, "Excuse me." She said, "No, Deacon." He said her name again with an edge in it and took a step forward, and Tobin moved between them. Not a big movement, one step sideways. But the kitchen changed temperature. Deacon said his brother's name. Tobin said no. Deacon told him to move. And Tobin Hale, 26 years old, who had flinched from that man since he was 3, said no a second time and did not move an inch. The kitchen went so quiet Merritt could hear the coffee maker dripping. Then Deacon laughed, that same short, ugly bark from the lawyer's office, and told Merritt she had turned his own brother against him. Merritt said he wasn't against him. She said he was finally standing beside her. Deacon's face did something complicated. He looked away first. He walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. Priscilla Ostrander came up the driveway 48 minutes later in a car 10 years old, and she was small and round and 62, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain and a quilted vest over a cardigan. And she looked like somebody's grandmother right up until she opened her mouth. Merritt met her on the porch. Priscilla looked her up and down once. Then she said, "All right, honey, show me the mill." Merritt showed her the chained doors and the swept path and the chaff in the iron ring. She lifted the trap door. She went down first with the lantern, and Priscilla followed her, one hand on the stone, 62 years old, and not saying a word about it. At the bottom, Priscilla Ostrander stood in the middle of that room and did not touch anything. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the rocking chair with the apron cushion. She looked at the cedar chest with 11 blue ribbons still tied. And she said one word, "Well." Then she asked who else knew. Merritt said herself, Sable Tobin, not Deacon. Priscilla said, "Keep it that way," and turned around to face her. She said, "Your stepbrother is going to argue your mother wasn't competent, and he is going to try to put a machine through this building before a judge can stop him, because a room that doesn't exist can't be evidence of anything." So they were going to do 3 things. One, file for an emergency injunction against demolition that day, not tomorrow, that day. Two, get a photographer out here before dark and document every letter, every photograph, every frame, every inch of that room under oath, so that if this place ever ceased to exist, it would still exist on paper, and no court on earth could pretend otherwise. Three, EI prepare for an emergency hearing on the injunction alone, not the whole will contest. That would take months. The injunction they could get in front of a judge fast because they had to. Merritt's eyes were wet. She said yes, ma'am, to all three. And then Priscilla Ostrander put one small hand on her arm and said something Merritt was not expecting. She said she had been doing this for 31 years, and that she knew a real mother when she saw one, and that woman was hers. She said he doesn't get to erase that. Merritt said no, ma'am, and Priscilla said good girl, and had no idea what those two words did to the girl standing in front of her. The next 4 days went fast. Priscilla filed by 3 that afternoon. A judge in Asheville signed a temporary restraining order by 5. The demolition company was served by 7. Deacon got his notice at 9 that night. Merritt heard him from the kitchen. His voice low in the hallway, then not low, then a chair going over, then a door. He came out at 10 and stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 of them. Merritt at the table, Tobin at the counter, and Sable sitting very still with a cup of tea in front of her that she had not touched. He said, "So this is how it's going to be." Nobody answered him. He said fine and walked out. He came back the next day with a lawyer from Charlotte, in a good suit, and papers started appearing on the kitchen table with phrases on them like undue influence and testamentary capacity. And Merritt stopped reading them, because reading them made her hands shake, and she needed her hands. She spent the days at the mill instead. Priscilla sent a photographer, a serious young man named Emmett, who set up lights on stands and photographed the room in sections, methodically saying almost nothing. On the second day, Merritt handed him the 12th letter to photograph, and he read the first 2 lines, "The way you can't help doing." And then he stopped and took his glasses off and pressed his knuckles against his eyes. He apologized. He said he didn't, usually. Merritt told him it was fine. And he said quietly that his own mother had died the year before, and that she had never written him anything. Then he put his glasses back on and kept working. Merritt thought about that all night, lying in the room over the garage. She thought about how many mothers there were in the world, and how many daughters, and how few of them ever got the letters they should have gotten. And she thought, even now, even bleeding, I was lucky. Sable did not leave the house that week. She sat on the porch, or in the kitchen, or in the chair beside Merritt's bed, mostly not talking, just being in the room. On the 3rd night, she asked Merritt if she'd read the album. Merritt said she had. Sable asked if she hated her. Merritt thought about it, actually thought about it for a while, because she was not going to lie to that woman after 12 years of everybody in that house lying. And then she said she didn't know yet. She said you watched. Sable said yes. Merritt said for 12 years you watched him do it and you took pictures. And Sable Hale said I took pictures because it was the only true thing I could do. I couldn't stop him. I couldn't tell him no. So I made a record, and I told myself that someday it would matter. And I have been ashamed of that every day since, because a record is not a rescue. Then she said, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to use it. Merritt did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay." And that was the whole conversation. And it was somehow enough to get them to the courthouse. The hearing was set for Thursday, 8 days after the funeral. The county courthouse in Asheville was gray stone with a flagpole out front, and the courtroom was smaller than Merritt had expected. Wooden benches, high windows, a brass lamp on the judge's bench. She wore a black dress, simpler than the funeral one. It was too big on her now. Priscilla noticed and said nothing about it, just reached over and straightened the collar the way a grandmother would. Sable came with her. Sable had done her hair that morning, sat her down at the kitchen table, and braided it 2 braids with her own hands. Merritt had almost come apart when she felt fingers in her hair. Nobody had braided her hair since she was 6 years old. Tobin met them at the courthouse doors in a suit, and he looked like a stranger and he looked like an adult. And he held the door open for both of them. Deacon was already inside, charcoal suit hair combed back, a man who had never lost anything in his life and had no plans to start. He glanced at Tobin and looked away. He glanced at Sable, and this time he did not look away. His mouth went tight. Sable sat down beside Merritt and did not look at him once. Priscilla laid out her folders slow and square, the way a farmer lays out tools before a long day. The judge came in. Wire glasses, gray hair, a woman somewhere in her 50s. She asked Priscilla what she was moving for, and Priscilla said, "A permanent injunction against demolition," and the judge asked on what grounds. And Priscilla Ostrander said, "Your Honor, the property at issue was the specific object of a specific and lucid bequest, and the co-heirs are now attempting to destroy it in advance of the will contest they themselves filed. That is spoliation of evidence. At absolute minimum, it is an effort to render the object of a bequest worthless before it can be defended." The Charlotte lawyer stood and smoothed his tie and said the mill was structurally unsound. He said the demolition was a safety measure. He said his client was concerned about undue influence, that the decedent had been in poor health for years, that her judgment had been affected. And then he said the sentence that made Merritt's stomach turn over. He said, "My client believes Miss Vale, who was in his mother's home by charity, exploited that condition." Priscilla put a hand flat on Merritt's arm under the table. The judge said Miss Ostrander response. And Priscilla stood up and said she had 3 witnesses and asked permission to call the first. The judge said proceed. And Priscilla Ostrander said the defense calls Tobin Hale. Tobin walked to the stand with his hands shaking so badly that he had to press one flat on the Bible instead of laying it there. Priscilla asked him to state his relationship to the decedent. He said stepson. He corrected himself before anyone else could. Said it fast like a man refusing to be given credit he hadn't earned. She asked him to describe his mother's relationship with Merritt Vale. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Merritt. Merritt nodded at him. And Tobin Hale said into a courtroom with his brother sitting 15 feet away, "My mother loved her. She loved her more than she loved us." Nobody moved. Deacon made a small sound and his lawyer put 2 fingers on his sleeve. Tobin kept going because once a man like that starts, he can't stop, and he said, "She raised us. She was good to us every day of our lives. But she loved Merritt in a way she never loved us. And it's because we didn't need it and Merritt did. My mother had a whole lifetime of love saved up with nowhere to put it. She'd been waiting to give it to somebody since before I was born." The judge made a note. Priscilla asked whether at any point in 12 years He had observed his stepsister exert pressure, manipulation, or coercion on the decedent. He said, "No, ma'am." She asked if he would say the opposite was true, and Tobin said yes. That his mother had to work to give Merritt anything because Merritt refused it. That Merritt would say she didn't need a new coat when the one she had didn't close. That Merritt said she didn't need to go to college. That his mother had to insist and argue and once actually raise her voice about a pair of boots because Merritt had been raised in a place where a child learns not to want things out loud. Priscilla said, "Thank you, no further questions." The Charlotte lawyer stood. He was good. He was smooth. He asked Tobin whether he'd ever been financially dependent on Merritt. Tobin said no. He asked whether Merritt had promised him anything in exchange for his testimony. Tobin said no. He asked whether he expected to benefit if the will stood. Tobin said he expected to lose 200 acres of his brother's goodwill and gain nothing at all. The lawyer changed tack. He said, and it came out with a little edge of contempt on it, "Isn't it true, Mr. Hale, that you've been estranged from your brother for years?" And Tobin, Hale, looked straight at Deacon and said, "No, sir. I've been afraid of my brother for years. That is not the same thing." The Charlotte lawyer stopped. He blinked once. Then he said no further questions and sat down, and Merritt watched him not look at his own client for a full 10 seconds. Priscilla stood back up and said, "The defense calls Sable Hale." Deacon turned around in his chair. He turned all the way around and stared at his sister. And it was the first time in 12 years Merritt had ever seen anything on that man's face that wasn't control. Sable stood. She did not look at him. She walked past his table close enough to brush it, and she did not look at him. And Merritt understood, watching her do it, that Sable had rehearsed exactly that walk, probably 100 times, lying awake. She put her hand on the Bible. She swore. Priscilla asked her to describe her relationship with Merritt Vale, and Sable Hale said, "I was cruel to her." The courtroom did not make a sound. Priscilla let it sit for a beat. Then she asked for how long. Sable said 12 years. Priscilla asked why, and Sable closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet. And she said, "Because I was afraid of my brother." Deacon's chair scraped. He was half out of it. His lawyer got a hand on his arm and pulled him down, and the judge looked at that table for exactly 2 seconds without saying anything at all, which was worse than a warning. Sable did not turn her head. She said, "My brother has run our family since our father died. He tried to run our mother, and she was harder to move than he expected. So he ran me instead, and he used me to get at her. Anything I got close to, he took away or he ruined. So I stayed away from Merritt on purpose. Because if he ever saw that I loved that girl, he would have used it. Against her, against me, against my mother." She said I told myself staying small was the same as staying safe. I was wrong about that for 12 years, and it cost a child everything. Priscilla asked whether there came a point when her stepmother asked her for help. Sable said yes. When? 2 years ago. Priscilla asked her to explain. And Sable Hale told a courtroom in Asheville about a room under a mill floor. She said Corvina had built it over many years alone, while she was still strong enough to carry things down 10 stone steps by herself. She said that after she got sick, and she was sick from 2021 on, whatever she told anybody, she couldn't manage it anymore. Priscilla asked her to do what specifically? Sable said, "Finish the room." Hangs the frames while she held the hammer. Build the shelf, carry down the letters. Priscilla asked what letters, and Sable said the letters she wrote to Merritt. One for every year Merritt had been her daughter. There are 12. The judge set her pen down on the bench. Priscilla asked whether at any point during those 2 years the decedent had seemed anything other than lucid. And Sable Hale said, "My stepmother was the most lucid person I have ever known in my life, right up to the last week of it. And even then, when she could barely lift the pen, she kept lifting it because she wasn't finished with the last one." Priscilla asked which one. Sable said 2023. Priscilla asked whether they had it. Sable said it was in evidence. Exhibit 12. Priscilla Ostrander walked to the table and picked up a single envelope with a blue ribbon still around it. She said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to read the final letter written by Corvina Hale to her daughter, dated 3 weeks before her death, authenticated by the witness who carried it down those stairs." The judge said, "Proceed," and Merritt's whole body went cold because she had not read that letter. She had opened 11 of them. She had left the last one tied on purpose, the way a person saves the last bite of something. Because as long as one was unopened, there was still something left of that woman she hadn't used up yet. She reached over and got hold of Sable's hand without meaning to. Sable held on. On her other side, Tobin took the other one. Priscilla opened the envelope. "My dearest Merritt, if you're reading this, then it's done, and I'm with your mother and father." "Yes, honey, yours, not Elias, yours." Merritt's hands went to her mouth, and Sable held onto her arm instead. "I have to tell you something now that I did not have the courage to tell you while I was alive. I told myself every year that I would. I'd sit her down when she's 10, when she's 12, when she's 15. And every single year I'd look at your face and think, not yet, she's finally happy, don't break it. So I'm going to break it now in a room where I don't have to watch your face when you find out." Merritt. "Your mother's name was Nella Vale. She was born in 1971. She was orphaned in 1978. She was 7 years old, and they sent her to a Catholic children's home in Asheville, St. Bernadette's, the same one where they took you 33 years later." The Charlotte lawyer looked up from his legal pad. "The summer she got there, I was 17 years old, doing a season of service at St. Bernadette's under my aunt, who was a sister of mercy there. Nella was small. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't eat. She was the saddest child I had ever laid eyes on. And I had been raised on a farm where things die. So that is saying something. My aunt asked me to sit with her, not to talk to her, just to sit, every day, all summer. So I did. And after 6 weeks, she started talking to me. And she called me Sister Corvina, even though I wasn't a sister. She called every woman who was kind to her sister. I have been called a lot of things in my life, honey. Wife, widow, farmer, mother, stepmother, sister. Corvina is the name I loved the best because a 7-year-old gave it to me for free. In August, a family came from Greensboro and took her home. They were good people. I met them. I watched them sign. She hugged me on the front steps of that home, and she said, "When I grow up, I'm going to have a daughter, and I'm going to love her the way you loved me." And then she got in the car, and I never saw her again. Merritt could not breathe. Behind her, somewhere in the gallery, a woman she did not know had started to cry. I went home. I married Elias 6 years later. Every year we were married, I prayed for a child of my own. He made his peace with it long before I did. I never quite made mine. I loved his 3, and I raised them as mine, and I would do it again. But there was a small place in me that never stopped asking God for one. And then in December of 2011, 2 nights before Christmas, I was standing in my kitchen with the news on, and there was a story about a young couple killed on the ice outside Asheville, and they put up a photograph of the mother, Merritt Honey. The picture on my television was Nella Vale, 39 years old, died alongside her husband Peter, survived by a 6-year-old daughter, and I stood in my own kitchen, and I knew before they even said the name, because I would have known that face at 100 years old. That was my little Nella. My little Nella had grown up and had a daughter and named her and loved her, and now that daughter was alone in the world. The judge had taken her glasses off. The next morning I called St. Bernadette's and asked where the child of Nella Vale had been placed. They told me they couldn't discuss placements. So I got in the truck and drove down there and sat in the front office and asked if anybody still remembered my aunt. A woman named Delphine came out. She was in her 60s by then. She had known my aunt 20 years. She had prayed with her and she had buried her. She listened to my whole story. She said she couldn't promise me one single thing. She said it would take months. She said I'd have to meet every standard the state set. Home study background check. References every hoop, every form, every visit, and that at my age and widowed, they would look hard at me. And then she said, but if this is real Corvina, and if God wants it, then be patient and do it right, and we will see. So I did it right, every form, every visit, every month of that year, not knowing if it would work, only knowing I'd spend whatever was left of my life trying. And in the fall of 2012, they called me, and they said your name out loud and asked if I still wanted to come meet you. I was in the truck inside of an hour. Priscilla's voice had gone rough. She stopped for a second and got it back. Merritt, my daughter, you were never charity. You were never some stranger I took in. You were the one I'd been waiting for my whole life. I just didn't know it until I saw your face on the news. You are not my adopted daughter. You are the daughter of the first daughter of my heart. You are a promise I made on a set of steps in 1978, and a promise God kept in 2011. And I have been trying to be worth it every day since. I didn't save you, honey. You saved me from dying without ever once holding a child of my own. All my love, always, forever. Even when you can't see me, Mama. Priscilla Ostrander lowered the page. Nobody in that room said anything at all. The judge set her glasses down on the bench and put one hand over her eyes for a moment and did not seem to care who saw her do it. Merritt was making a sound she couldn't stop. Sable had both arms around her. Tobin had his head down. And Deacon Hale was looking at the floor between his own shoes, and he did not lift his head again. The judge finally spoke, and her voice was not entirely steady either. She looked at the Charlotte lawyer and asked whether he'd like to withdraw the motion regarding demolition. The man stood up slowly. He glanced at his client. His client did not look back at him. He said, Your Honor, we withdraw the motion. And the challenge to testamentary capacity. We'll need to consult with our client. The judge said, Do that today. Then she said, In the meantime, I am issuing a permanent injunction against demolition of the property at issue, and I am ordering that the contents of that property, correspondence, photographs, personal effects, all of it, be inventoried and preserved under seal pending resolution of any further contest of this will. She wrote something. Then she looked up. She said, Miss Vale. Merritt stood up. Her legs were not working right, and Sable stood up with her hand under her elbow. The judge said she was very sorry for her loss. Merritt got out a thank you. And then Judge Alma Reyes said this, and she said it slowly, on the record in front of a court reporter and a gallery, and a man in a charcoal suit who was still looking at the floor. I have been on this bench 18 years. I have heard a great many wills read in this room. I have never once had a mother introduce herself to me the way that woman just did. Whatever the paperwork says, wherever this case goes from here, in this courtroom on this record, your mother was your mother. Merritt's mouth came apart. She said thank you twice and could not manage a third. The judge nodded once and said they were adjourned. Deacon did not come home that night. He called Corbin Whitlock the next morning and withdrew the will contest. He signed the papers at 11. By noon, he was in his car headed east on the interstate. He did not say goodbye to his brother. He did not say anything at all to Sable. He left a voicemail for Merritt that was 14 seconds long, and she has never told anybody what was on it, and she deleted it without playing it twice. He never came back to Hollowford. Sable stayed. She gave up her apartment in Raleigh in the first week of April. She took the guest room. She started in on the fence out by the north pasture because it needed doing and nobody else had time. And she was bad at it, genuinely bad. The posts went in crooked, and she split 3 rails in one afternoon. And her hands blistered and then bled and then calloused. She kept going. Tobin stayed too. He quit his job in town and asked. Merritt actually asked her formally, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, like a hired man, whether she could use help running the place. Merritt said yes, and the 3 of them ate dinner together every night at the table in the kitchen where Corvina used to hum. Nobody said grace at first. Nobody knew how to start. Then one night in May, without any warning at all, Sable did it. She stumbled through the whole thing. Her voice broke twice, and she had to start a sentence over. Nobody looked at her while she did it, which was the kindest thing any of them could have done. And when she finished, Tobin reached across the table and took her hand, and Merritt took the other one. And the 3 of them sat there like that for a long time without a word. 3 grown children of a woman who had loved every one of them, just not the same, and not enough, and somehow still enough to bring them back to the same table. Merritt did not go back down into that room for 11 days after the hearing. She could not have explained why. Priscilla thought she was afraid of it, and Sable thought she was grieving, and both of them were wrong. The truth was smaller and harder. Merritt had spent 12 years being a girl who was allowed to stay, and now she was a woman who owned something, and she did not know how to walk into a room that had been built for her by somebody who was gone. She went down on the 12th day. She swept the path in the mill first the way it had always been swept, because now she understood that the sweeping had been part of it, that Corvina had kept a clean path to a trapdoor for years, so that whoever finally came would have something to follow. She lit the lantern. She went down the 10 steps. She sat in the rocking chair, and she said out loud into that quiet, "You should have told me." That was the first thing. Not thank you. Not I love you. You should have told me. Because Merritt Vale had spent 3 years watching a woman get thinner and telling herself she was imagining it, and 11 years wondering in the dark whether she was really anybody's daughter, and every single night of that had been unnecessary. She cried about it for a while, Then she got angry about it, which surprised her. And then she sat there long enough for the anger to burn down into something else, and what was underneath it was this Corvina Hale. Hale had made a bad decision out of love, and had known it was a bad decision and had made it anyway every year for 12 years, and had written every one of those years down so that Merritt would eventually get the whole truth instead of half of it. That was not perfect. It was just the most honest thing anybody had ever done for her. She put her hand flat on the arm of the rocking chair, where a hand had worn the finish thin. And she said out loud, "Okay." She meant, "I forgive you." She just couldn't get there in one sentence, so she used the one she had. The paperwork took until August. Priscilla Ostrander drove up from Asheville 4 separate times to finish it and would not send a bill. And on the 4th visit, it got the story out of her that 31 years ago, Priscilla had been a young lawyer with an 8-month-old and no money, and had lost a house, and that Corvina Hale had heard about it in the checkout line at a feed store 2 counties away, and had co-signed a note for a woman she had met exactly once. Priscilla said she'd been waiting 3 decades to return that. She said she was going to be irritated for the rest of her life that it took the woman dying for her to get the chance. The title cleared. The mill and the half-acre were Merritt's outright, permanently unencumbered, with a court order sealed into the county record protecting the contents. Merritt has said since that she felt nothing at all when the letter came confirming it. She read it, standing at the mailbox, folded it, put it in her back pocket, and went to go check the water in the north pasture, because there was a heifer out there that had been off her feed for 2 days, and that seemed more urgent. Farm should have failed that first year. Nobody in that house had ever run it. Corvina had run it alone for 16 years and had kept the whole operation in a set of spiral notebooks and in her own head. And the head was gone. Merritt got the notebooks out of the kitchen drawer in the 2nd week of May and sat down at the table with them and understood inside of 10 minutes that she was in trouble. Feed contracts. A line of credit at the co-op she hadn't known existed. A vet bill from February. A tractor payment. And 200 acres of north pasture that now belonged to Deacon Hale, who had made it extremely clear through his lawyer that the grazing arrangement his stepmother had allowed for 12 years was as of June 1st terminated. That was the real punch. Not the courtroom. That. He couldn't take the mill, so he took the grass. Merritt sat at that table with a calculator and figured out she'd have to sell down the herd by a third to make it through winter. And she put her head in her hands. And Sable Hale, standing at the sink, with her back to the room, said, without turning around, that there were 60 acres in her name. Merritt looked up. Sable said the house and 3 acres came to her in the will. But their father had put 60 acres of the east bottomland in her name in 2009 for tax reasons. And everybody had forgotten about it, including her, until she'd found the deed going through a box in the attic in April. She said the grass down there was better than the north pasture anyway. She said it flatly, at the sink, not turning around, which was the only way that woman could give anybody anything. Merritt said she couldn't take it, and Sable said she wasn't giving it. She said she was paying rent in grass for a room in a house she had no legal right to be sleeping in, and that Merritt could either accept that or they could both keep being ridiculous about it. Then she said the dishes were done and left the kitchen. Merritt sat there for a long moment. Then she wrote East Bottom, 60 ACS. In the margin of Corvina's notebook, in her own handwriting, on a page that already had that woman's handwriting on it. They made it through the winter. Tobin was the one who found the ledger. It was September, and he was up in the mill loft looking for a pulley, and he came down the ladder holding a hard-bound account book gone soft at the corners. It was the mills from 1958 to 1974. Every load of corn and wheat that had come through that building, whose it was, what it weighed, what was owed. And on the back page, in a completely different hand in pencil, somebody had written a list of names with amounts next to them and the word forgiven across the whole column. 14 families in Hollow Ford who had ground grain in 1972 and 1973 and had not been able to pay for it, and whose debts Corvina's father-in-law had wiped out and never mentioned again. Merritt took that book down to the room under the floor and put it on the shelf beside the 12 letters. And she stood there for a minute with her hand on it, because she understood, holding it, that she had not walked into a story that started with her. That mill had been a place where people got carried when they couldn't carry themselves for 50 years before Merritt Vale was born. Corvina hadn't invented that. She had just moved it underground when she needed to hide something precious. And that was the night Merritt started to think about what a building like that is actually for. The idea did not arrive all at once, and it was not noble at the start. It started because of a girl at the co-op. October, a Tuesday, and Merritt was loading mineral tubs, and there was a girl working the register who was maybe 16 and had a bruise on her forearm in the shape of fingers, and who flinched when the manager came around the corner behind her. Merritt watched her flinch, and something went through her so hard she had to put a hand on the tailgate. Because she knew that flinch. She had done that flinch. She had done it in a kitchen with a wooden spoon on the stove and a man in the doorway asking when dinner would be ready. She thought about that girl for 4 days. On the 5th day, she called Delphine Marchetti. Delphine was 73 by then and had retired from St. Bernadette's 5 years earlier, and then still answered the phone like she hadn't. Merritt introduced herself. There was a pause on the line, and then the old woman said in a voice that shook, "Oh, child. Oh, I know exactly who you are." She said she had prayed for Corvina Hale every day for 12 years and had never once known how it turned out. Merritt told her all of it. The mill, the room, the 12 letters, the hearing, the judge. Delphine Marchetti did not say a word for so long that Merritt thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "I told her to be patient and do it right. And she did it right, and I have wondered about that girl for 13 years. And Merritt asked her a question. She asked what it would take to bring children out to a farm. It took 11 months. Merritt has never once described that process as inspiring. She has described it as forms, background checks on all 3 of them, a fire inspection, a well water test that failed the first time on nitrates and cost her $1,900 to fix. Liability insurance. Nobody would write until Priscilla Ostrander made 4 phone calls, and then a 5th one in a tone Merritt had never heard her use. A state licensing packet that ran to 61 pages, of which Merritt filled out the first 30 wrong. She did them all again. Delphine drove up from Asheville twice a month and sat at that kitchen table with reading glasses on and went through every page with a pencil. And on the day they finally got the approval letter, she cried harder than Merritt did. Sable built the bunk room in the old creamery, badly at first and then better. Tobin fenced the paddock and put a gate in it. A child could work alone, which he insisted on, and which Merritt did not understand until he said quietly that a kid should be able to get out of a place without asking anybody's permission. Merritt named it Nella House. She never explained why to anyone, not even Priscilla. It went on the paperwork and into the county record and onto a small painted sign at the head of the drive. And Merritt let every single person in Hollow Ford assume it was a family name, which it was. The first van came on a Saturday in April. The spring Merritt turned 21. 6 girls ages 8 to 12, hair braided by somebody in a hurry, eyes doing the thing that Merritt's eyes had done in 2012. The fast sweep of a room for exits. She had been up since 4. She had made bread. She had rehearsed nothing on purpose because she remembered being on the other side of a rehearsed sentence. The first girl off the van was small, maybe 8. Dark hair, big eyes hanging on to the hand of an older girl who might have been her sister and might not. Merritt crouched down. Her knees popped when she went. Loud in the quiet, a farm girl sound she had earned at 21 from 4 years of hauling feed. And she did not care one bit. And somewhere behind her sternum, something turned over because she knew exactly whose knees she was hearing. She said, "Hi, honey." The little girl didn't answer. And Merritt Vale said the only words she had ever been sure of. She said, "I don't need you to talk. I don't need you to smile. I don't need you to like me today or tomorrow or ever." The child's eyes came up. Just a little. Just enough. Merritt said there was a cat inside. She said his name was Cream, and that he was Butter's grandson, and that he was not very smart, but he was kind. There was a long pause. Then the little girl whispered something, and Merritt had to lean in and ask her to say it again. She had asked whether the cat was really named Cream. And Merritt said, "Cross my heart." And a child who had not voluntarily let go of her sister's hand since the van left Asheville, let go of it, walked across the gravel, and put a small hand into a rough one. Merritt had to look away for a second. She looked at the tree line and she got her face under control, and she stood up. And that was the whole beginning of it. They came every other weekend after that. The girls fed calves and gathered eggs and made a mess of the bread and sat on the porch swing 3 at a time. Sable taught them to drive fence staples and was terrifyingly patient about it. Tobin taught them the names of every tool in the shop and let them ruin 2 of them. Nobody made them talk. That was the rule. And it was the only one Merritt was rigid about. If a child wanted to spend a whole Saturday sitting on the bottom porch step, doing nothing at all, that was allowed, and nobody was to ask her why. 3 of them did exactly that the first summer. All 3 eventually stopped. There is one more thing, and Merritt has told it exactly twice, and both times she had to stop in the middle. The August after the second season, a girl named Whitney, 13, difficult 2 placements, in 18 months, the kind of kid the paperwork calls challenging, asked why the mill door was chained. Merritt said it wasn't locked, just chained. Whitney asked what was down there, and Merritt stood there in the yard with a bucket in each hand and thought about it for a long moment. Then she set the buckets down and took that girl out across the pasture and unwound the chain and lit the lantern and took her down the 10 steps. Whitney stood in the middle of that room and turned in a slow circle and looked at every photograph on every wall. Then she said, "Who is she?" And Merritt said, "Me." Whitney asked who took them. Merritt said her mother, and that she hadn't known any of them were being taken. The girl stood there a while longer. Then she asked in a voice she was clearly trying to keep flat, "Why would somebody do that?" Merritt said, "Because she loved me, and she wasn't allowed to say so out loud." And Whitney, 13 years old, 2 placements hard as a fence post. Said nobody's doing that for me. Merritt did not say that's not true, because it might have been true, and the girl would have known it. She said, I don't know, but I've got a camera. Whitney looked at her. Merritt said she'd been taking pictures at the farm for 2 years and had never done anything with them. And if Whitney wanted, there was wall space down here that wasn't spoken for. The girl did not say yes. She said maybe, which from her was enormous. There are now 41 photographs on the walls of that room that are not of Merritt Vale. The first one is a 13-year-old girl standing in a paddock with a halter in her hand, scowling straight at the camera. She is 22 now. She works for the state in Charlotte. She comes up 2 or 3 times a year, and she always goes down those stairs by herself for a few minutes before she says hello to anybody. Merritt saw Deacon once more. It was 6 years later at a funeral in Weaverville for a man they'd both known, and he was standing at the back with Gray, coming in at the temples, and a woman Merritt didn't recognize. He saw her. She saw him see her. He crossed the room and stopped about 4 feet away, and he said her name, and he said she looked well. Merritt said thank you. He said he heard the farm was doing all right. She said it was. And then he stood there for maybe 5 seconds too long, and Merritt understood that he was waiting, that some part of that man had come across a funeral parlor, hoping to be asked a question that would let him say something. She didn't ask it, not out of cruelty. She thought about it afterward driving home, and she was fairly sure it wasn't cruelty. It was just that she had a farm to get back to, and 6 girls coming on Saturday. And there was nothing that man could say that would make any of it different. He said, take care of yourself. She said, you too, and she meant it. In the flat way, you mean it to a stranger. And that was the entire conversation. And she has not thought about him more than a handful of times since. Sable did not speak to her brother again. Ever. She told Merritt once, years later, that she'd stopped being angry at him around year 4 and had discovered that what was underneath the anger was nothing at all, and that the nothing was the best thing that had ever happened to her. The spring Merritt turned 30. The daffodils came up the whole length of the east bottom thick enough that you could see the yellow from the porch. She stood out there with a cup of coffee in Corvina's blue cardigan, which she had learned by then to have re-knit at the elbows twice by a woman in town rather than let it go. Sable was asleep upstairs. She was 62 and slower, and still fixing fence badly. Tobin was in the barn with a first calf heifer that had been up all night. Down the drive, the white van was pulling in. Merritt set her coffee on the rail and walked down the porch steps. 8 girls this time. The first one off was small, maybe 8 dark hair, big careful eyes, one hand clamped around the strap of a bag that almost certainly held everything she owned. Merritt crouched down. Her knees popped loud and she did not care. And she said, hi, honey. I don't need you to talk. I don't need you to smile. I don't need you to like me today or tomorrow or ever. She said there was a cat inside named Biscuit who was Cream's grandson, who was not very smart, but who was kind. The little girl whispered a question and Merritt leaned in. Cross my heart. That afternoon, while the girls were down in the paddock, with Tobin, Merritt walked out to the mill. She swept the path. She lifted the door. She went down the 10 steps and sat in the rocking chair with the apron cushion on it, and she looked at 12 photographs of a girl and 41 photographs of other people's children, and she said out loud into the quiet, there was a little one today, Mama. She reminded me of me. The room did not answer. It never has. But Merritt sat there a while anyway, the way you sit with somebody, and then she climbed the stairs and closed the door and walked back across the pasture. On the porch, she set out 2 cups, one for herself and one for the empty chair beside her, and she filled both. She had been doing it for 11 years by then and had long since stopped feeling foolish about it. The little girl from the van came up the steps and stood at the rail and looked at the 2 cups for a while. Then she asked who the other one was for. And Merritt Vale looked out at a field full of daffodils and said, "For somebody who waited for me my whole life and never told me. So now I wait for her every morning." The child thought about that for a long time, genuinely thought the way children do when nobody hurries them. Then she reached up and very carefully moved Corvina's cup so it sat exactly in the middle of the table. She said, "That's important." And Merritt said, "Yes, sweetheart, it really is. Because love does not stop when the person does. It just learns how to sit in an empty chair and wait for whoever needs it next." A promise was made on the front steps of a children's home in the summer of 1978 by a 17-year-old girl to a 7-year-old orphan who called her sister Corvina. That promise did not end when Nella Vale died on the ice. It did not end when Corvina Hale died in her own bed with a smile on her face, like she'd just been told something good. It did not end at all. It went underground for 12 years into a room beneath a mill floor that 3 grown people laughed at in a lawyer's office. And it came back up the stairs in the hands of a girl they said was worth nothing. They mocked the mill because they could not imagine that anything they had thrown away could be worth having. They were wrong about the building, and they were wrong about the woman, and they were wrong about the girl. And every second Saturday in a valley in the Blue Ridge, another child who has been told she is nobody's puts her hand into a rough one and finds out for the first time in her life that she has always been someone worth waiting for.